Lucretia Mott once said, "Any great change must expect opposition, because it shakes the very foundation of privilege." Although it isn't always obvious, the women's rights movement has existed as far back as the 17th and 18th centuries. One example of this was in 1776 when Abigail Adams wrote a letter to her husband John Adams asking the men to remember the women of America when fighting for independence and rights. The Seneca Falls Convention was the first women's rights convention in the history of the United States. It set the foundation of the movement, especially in the United States. The Seneca Falls Convention is very important in the history of America because it spread new ideas about equality, was a first step in the American women's rights movement, and created many strong political leaders. Women in America had been craving rights and power since the beginning of history. However, the women's rights movement in America didn't blossom until the mid to late 1800s. The first big examples of women taking on big responsibilities and power was during the American Revolution. Women were greatly relied on to make clothes, cook, wash supplies and clothes, and provide medical help when necessary. Some women, such as Molly Pitcher, actually fought in the war when their husbands were hurt or died. Women eventually started calling for more rights and power. They were maddened at the many injustices such as not being able to divorce a husband, not being able to vote, not being able to own property, not having as much access to jobs, etc. The women's rights movement arose in Europe before America. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, two of the main leaders of the Seneca Falls Convention, first met in London in 1840. They were both attending the World Anti-Slavery Convention with their husbands. The convention excluded women delegates solely based on their sex, and as a result, the two women became determined to hold a women's rights convention. 8 years later, they reunited in Seneca Falls. In the meanwhile, law officials had been making unfair laws such as prohibiting married women to own property, etc., and by 1848, equality was a large and relevant issue. By July 1848, Elizabeth Cady Stanton had become frustrated with her role staying at home raising kids and convinced Lucretia Mott, Martha Coffin Wright, and Mary McClintock to help organize the Seneca Falls Convention. The group began to write its primary document, the Declaration of Sentiments. They eventually announced information about a convention to discuss the social, civic, and religious condition and rights of women. The Seneca Falls Convention was held at the Wesleyan Chapel in Seneca Falls, New York. It was in session from July 19th through 20th, 1848. The Seneca Falls Convention was very successful in spreading new ideas about equality. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, one of the meeting's organizers, began with a speech about the convention's goals and purpose. Stanton said, "We are assembled to protest against a form of government existing without the consent of the governed, to declare our right to be free as men is free, to be represented in the government which we are taxed to support, to have such disgraceful laws as give man the power to chastise and imprison his wife, to take the wages which she earns, the property which she inherits, and, in case of separation, the children of her love." This is just one example of a powerful statement from the convention. Although the first convention wasn't very large, it got sufficient coverage in newspapers in New York and around the country. More people soon began believing that women and all people deserve equal rights. Even those who were skeptical of full equality came to the conclusion that if Americans really believed in the Constitution, then every person does have the right to equal privilege. On August 2nd, 1848, the convention reassembled at the First Unitarian Church in Rochester, New York. The convention rediscussed its main goals. However, this time a much larger audience was present. The convention continued to receive positive press. However, there was also criticism. Many people still believed women's rights were a joke and that women were meant to serve others. For instance, when remarking on the convention, One editor said it was a most insane and ludicrous farce. Stanton took the criticism as a compliment and remarked, "It will start women thinking, and men too, and when men and women think about a new question, the first step in progress is taken." Even in that short amount of time, the number of supporters and awareness of the movement increased drastically. The Seneca Falls Convention was the first big step in the women's rights movement because it inspired many in addition to spreading new ideas. At the time of the first meeting of the convention, there was not much publicity or advertising of the event. Despite this, nearly 300 people showed up. Only women were allowed to attend the first day of the convention, but on the second day, men were welcome to attend as well. The Seneca Falls Convention created an official document called the Declaration of Sentiments. This document was the first of its kind because it listed women's complaints, grievances, and demands. It also called for women to speak out for what they want. One section of the Declaration of Sentiments states, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights governments are instituted, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed." It clearly demanded that the government give equal rights to all of the governed people, not only because it is stated in the Declaration of Independence, but also because every person was given these rights by God. In addition to this document, the convention also created a list of 11 resolutions. These resolutions further explained rights that women demanded. Some of these involved women's rights in the church, in the workplace, and in the field of education. All of these resolutions passed with the exception of the ninth, which demanded women's right to vote. This resolution caused controversy and arguments. Anti-suffragists claimed that women didn't want to vote, and that since they spent so much time in their homes and with children, they weren't updated on politics and wouldn't have the time to vote. Others argued that women weren't smart enough to make political choices, and that women's votes would simply double the electorate. Voting would cost more without adding any new value. However, Stanton and African-American abolitionist Frederick Douglass gave impassioned speeches in the Ninth Resolution's defense before it eventually and barely passed. Especially after its second meeting, the Seneca Falls Convention gained national recognition. It was extremely important because it was the first big example of women demanding rights. Not only did the major figures in the convention become stronger and more empowered, but a huge number of people across the country took up the movement as well. For many years after the Seneca Falls Convention, women continued to fight for equality in law and society. Many of these activists referred to the Declaration of Sentiments while working for justice. Ultimately, one of the biggest social movements in history, the women's suffrage movement, was a result of this convention. After more than 7 decades of fighting, women eventually gained the right to vote. Many of the strongest advocates in this movement originated from the Seneca Falls Convention. As mentioned above, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, one of the main leaders at Seneca Falls, who was 32 at the time of the convention, would spend the rest of her life fighting for the right to vote. In fact, just a month after the second meeting of the convention, in her address on women's rights, she said, "Now is the time, now empathetically, for the women of this country to buckle on the armor that can best resist the weapons of the enemy, ridicule, and holy horror." Other popular activists such as Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass also participated in the convention and continued their work for several more decades. Sadly, only one of the main founders of the convention, Charlotte Woodard Pierce, was alive to witness the signing of the 19th Amendment allowing women to vote. Obviously, the Seneca Falls Convention had a great effect on not only the people involved, but also the country. It successfully spread lots of new ideas about power and equality, as well as being the groundwork for the women's rights movement in the United States, and as a result, harvesting many excellent leaders. Many of these figures, including Stanton and Pierce, continued to influence politics and society by fighting throughout the rest of their lifetimes for justice, as well as encouraging others to do the same. We see the effects of this today in things such as the 19th Amendment, Women's History Month, and new ideas of empowerment. However, this movement is still seen today, especially in terms of equal pay and treatment in the workforce. This convention was only one example of how extraordinary, strong, and influential women can be when they come together.